This video is an introduction to our new topic of diet and lifestyle diseases, and I'd like to start with this quote by Edward Stanley. "Those who think they have no time for healthy eating will sooner or later have to find time for illness." Throughout this video, we'll establish the link between healthy eating and illness, as well as explore other diet and lifestyle factors that can lead to chronic disease. Let's start by having a look at Australia's health in general. The infographic to the right shows the total number of deaths in Australia per annum at around about 140,000. You can then see, branching off from here, the single largest cause of death is from circulatory system related illness, followed closely by cancer and then respiratory disease, accidents, digestive system and other internal causes. Overall, 1 in 5 Australians are affected by more than one chronic disease. A chronic disease is an illness that has long-term consequences. Chronic diseases account for 90% of all deaths in Australia. The statistics are pretty striking. Over 1 in 5, or 22% of Australians over the age of 18, have cardiovascular disease. Cancer causes 3 out of every 10 deaths in Australia. 1 in 19 Australians have diabetes. To understand the reason underlying these chronic diseases, we need to first understand about health risk factors. Risk factors are attributes, characteristics, or exposures that increase the likelihood of a person developing a disease or disorder. These risk factors may be diet or lifestyle related. We could summarise this as behavioural, so our behaviour affects our likelihood to develop a disease or disorder, or they could be biomedical, which means some kind of bodily state that could be influenced by your behaviour, so something such as blood pressure could be influenced by your diet or your lifestyle, but it could also have a genetic origin. Let's look first at the behavioural risk factors. The latest statistics published by the Australian Government show that almost 1 in 6 Australian adults, or 16% of Australian adults, smoke on a daily basis. 1 in 5 Australian adults, or 20%, consume more than the recommended 2 standard drinks per day. If we look at diet, over 1 in 2, or more than half of Australian adults, do not eat enough fruit on a daily basis, and a staggering 9 in 10 Australian adults do not eat the recommended 5 serves of vegetables a day. Finally, over 1 in 2 Australian adults are not sufficiently active, so they don't meet the recommended daily exercise target of 30 minutes. These are all behavioural risk factors, habits, ways of living that we can change, that we have control over, that contribute to our risk of developing a disease or disorder. Now let's consider the biomedical risk factors. Remember, we said that these are conditions of our body, our physical body, that may be caused by our behavioural factors, or they could have a genetic origin. So, the first and probably most significant biomedical risk factor is that almost 2 in 3 Australian adults are overweight or obese, according to the BMI, or Body Mass Index classification. More about this later. Second risk factor is that almost a third of Australian adults have high blood pressure. Almost 2/3 of Australian adults have abnormal cholesterol levels or high blood lipid levels. A much smaller percentage, but still important, is 3.1% of Australian adults have impaired fasting glucose, which puts them at risk of developing diabetes down the track. All this could sound quite depressing. However, it's important to remember that most risk factors can be minimised. In fact, the leading risk factors for chronic disease are dietary risks, accounting for 11% of all disease, a high body mass index, accounting for 9%, and smoking, accounting for 8%. So I guess the moral of the story here is that eating well, maintaining a healthy weight, and not smoking all reduce your likelihood of chronic disease. Let's have a look at the so-called web of chronic disease, as shown in the image below. As you can see, most diseases have more than one risk factor. The risk factors are listed on the left-hand side: tobacco use, alcohol use, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, diet, physical inactivity, and obesity. If we trace these back to cardiovascular disease, we can see that every single one of them has some kind of an impact on the development of cardiovascular disease, the number one killer in Australia. Cancer is connected to 5 of the 7 major risk factors. Chronic lung disease is listed here, simply related to tobacco use, but diabetes linked to diet, physical activity, and obesity. So what you can see is that in this topic, and when we look at disease in Australia in general, there's a lot of overlap, and having a good understanding of the risk factors and the diseases, we'll be able to get a much clearer picture of health in Australia and then start to think about how we can improve the health of everyday Australians. This final slide is a similar but slightly different representation of the different risk factors and their association with various diseases. So, in the left-hand column, the chronic diseases are listed starting with CVD, or cardiovascular disease, at the top, stroke, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, and so on. What you can then see in the subsequent columns is that tobacco smoking is a significant risk factor for all but 3 of the listed diseases. Insufficient physical activity relates to the top 4 leading causes of death, and so on. We can certainly see that tobacco smoking, insufficient physical activity, dietary risks, obesity, but also alcohol intake have a very significant impact on the development of chronic disease. In subsequent videos, we'll learn about the specific diseases, their symptoms, and how to prevent them, and always link back to these risk factors. I hope you can see that by understanding the common risk factors and realising that they are within our control, a great number of the chronic diseases that are contributing to the ill health of our community can be prevented.